Okay, so I'll get started here. My name is Chris Haugen from Remote Scientific Advancements here. Um, we're going to go through a webinar on using Cambistat to preserve our legacy trees. We'll have about a half hour of content, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Um, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you do have questions, enter them into the question box, and Matt Karst here, who's on the other end of this call, will kind of flag me and then have me respond to them. And certainly, if there's questions that are in particular pertinent to what we're talking about at the moment, I'll answer those as we go. But I may wait, even though I saw your question, I may wait to answer towards the end. We are recording the webinar so that you can watch it and listen to it over and over again if you so choose. And then if you do have an ISA certification number and you'd like to get CEUs, make sure you put yourself and any of your fellow attendees that are in the room with you into um, the box, and we'll get those entered in so we can get you credit for your CEUs. So thank you. So kind of what we'll go through today is I want to talk to you a little bit about just kind of so everyone's on the same page. What is a plant growth regulator? And then how does Cambistat work? And really with the intention of giving you the understanding of what is it that that Cambistat in particular is actually doing to manage the plant, and then what are we going to use that for to leverage as an arborist or a landscape manager to do. So what are the benefits of it, and then also some basic research results, and then we'll go through just kind of a general application of Cambistat, from a case study perspective of what can we actually leverage this tool to do. So to start with, we'll give everyone kind of an idea of what is a plant growth regulator and what is Cambistat. Where does it fit into this world of plant health? So when we're talking about a plant growth regulator, it's something that is artificially impacting a plant hormone. So if you think back to your plant physiology days, the five plant hormones being auxins, gibberellin, cytokinins, ethylene, and abscisic acid, they all play a role in plant development or fruit development. And what we're doing is using something that is going to impact those plant hormones. So in most people think of things like herbicides. Herbicides are often interacting with auxins or cytokinins to kill the plant or to kill the chlorophyll. We are using a growth retardant to inhibit the production of gibberellin. So in the case of Cambistat, we are talking about a growth retardant. And a soil application. And this is really focused on mature trees, declining trees, and stress trees or high value trees. But then we also have a cousin product, which there's been a webinar on TrimTech that you can check out as well. It's a lower percent active ingredient, so not quite as a heavy a dose, but it's going to be applied primarily as a foliar spray, but you can do it on some intended uses for soil application on shrubs, hedges, or very small trees, and then ground covers, vines, and perennials. But today we're going to focus primarily on Cambistat. And I mentioned how Cambistat works. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a soil applied product. And what makes it a really useful tool, being that it's soil applied, is that it is truly systemic. So it is going to be applied to the mineral soil, uptaken by the root system, and then distributed for us by the plant to all the actively growing tissues. So it'll end up primarily at that apical meristem. So up here in the very top, right where the branches are elongating, there's active cell division. That is where it's going to primarily end up, and it's going to be inhibiting gibberellic acid. And what does gibberellic acid do? Well, it does primarily, among many things, it is what causes cells to actually expand. So we're not going to be impacting the number of cells that are going to be dividing or created in the plant. It's merely how big does each cell get. And this is what gives us the physical growth regulation of the branches. If we were perhaps using a different growth retardant that inhibited auxin production, acid being produced in the plant, which is going to slow the cell elongation. But that also gives you an increase in the production of chlorophyll and an increase in the production of abscisic acid. So it's a twofold and a really nice um, material for giving you also improved plant health. So you get a 2-for-1 with one application of Cambistat. And we'll kind of go into how each of those work and what they really do. In a really nice paper that was put out by Dr. Dan Herms, formerly of Ohio State, he put out a theory of kind of what does a tree really allocate its energy towards. So when you go through photosynthesis and cellular respiration, what does the plant actually utilize all that energy for? And what he put forth the idea being that the vast majority of the energy goes to vegetative and shoot growth, so what's above ground. And then some amount of it goes to reproductive structures, root development, defense compounds, and then storage for the lean times of the winter and the next year. But what we're actually doing is by reallocating and inhibiting that vegetative and shoot growth, the plant is still going to be producing generally the same amount of energy, but we're going to be allowing the plant to reallocate that energy towards other parts of its growing habit. So what we see is generally a higher proportion of that energy going to root growth, defense compound, and storage, and a little bit into reproductive. Actually, paclobutrazole, the active ingredient in Cambistat, is used in other countries for increase in fruit production in apples or pears and plums. But because we're reducing that vegetative shoot growth, we know that it's showing more allocation towards the root development and defense compound and storage from what we see the plant actually doing out in the landscape. And we see an increase in all of those subsequently. And when I talked about, there's really two changes, and it's both because of the hormone. So you have the reduction in gibberellic acid, or the cell elongation hormone. That's what gives you the actual physical size growth regulation, which we can use that to slow the canopy growth for a variety of situations in the landscape. What you have is, instead of maybe a tree branch growing, let's say in this case on this 4 inches per year, we're going to have that single year's growth in about 1 inch. But generally speaking, the plant still retains its appearance, its color, and its shape, because all the plant parts remain intact but are just smaller and shorter. And it does vary depending on tree species. We generally recommend that about a 40 to 70% growth reduction in an annual branch elongation. Some plants, such as sweet gum, 1 year after a Cambistat application, it could reduce the growth by about 90%. Locust is fairly similar. Some plant material, such as pines or spruce or other conifers, you're closer to probably about 15 to 25% growth reduction. And in oaks, which are probably a really common target species for a growth regulator, you can not only see the tightness of the leaf tissue, but also the color change is important to note, that it can help alleviate some of that environmental stress that you might experience in the mid-dry summer, or if you have potentially some environmental stress due to poor soil conditions. And on top of not just looking at the branch reduction, you can also look at the actual ring development. So if you have trees that are growing in tree wells, or where there's maybe a hardscape growing adjacent, or a hardscape adjacent to the growing tree, you can extend the usable life of that plant out for many years. So in this case, think of in your urban environments like cities where there's tree growth, the average lifespan might be in a good timeline, 7 years, maybe 10. If you're slowing the development of that trunk tissue out, you might be able to get 14 or 15 years. It's still going to continue to grow undoubtedly, but it just extends the usable life of that. And we actually have a really interesting study in Florida looking at concrete heaving and buttress root development. kind of to quantify and put additional numbers around this of what you might be able to expect. The second change is, as I mentioned earlier, an increase in abscisic acid. And a lot of people think of this as the tree protection or the stress hormone. And it's really energy that's not used for branch elongation, as I mentioned, is allowed and freed up for other uses within the plant. So we see an increase in chlorophyll production, an increase in fibrous root development, thicker leaves with more of the protective trichomes of leaf hairs, and stomata are stimulated to slow water loss much more rapidly than they would if they weren't treated, and an increase in defense compounds like the phenols and the polyphenols. As I mentioned, you get a thicker leaf that's better able to retain moisture during the hot and dry period. So we have here a untreated plant on the left and a treated plant on the right. And this is in cherry bark oak. You can see the thickness of the leaf is much greater with a treated plant. That's going to give you much better water retention. It's not going to desiccate as quickly. You'll have less of the summer leaf scorch, especially in the tough growing environment that we often put urban trees in. This will give you a much better ability to tolerate those tough growing conditions. If we're looking at drought protection, as I alluded to before, the stomata are a key component in what our plant is dealing with. Stomata are what allow for water vapor to release from the leaf tissue. And if these close, especially during periods of drought or additional stress, if they close faster, the plant isn't going to be losing as much water vapor as quickly. So this means that in periods of drought, where maybe in between watering, you can utilize that moisture that would be in the soil or is taken into the root system much more efficiently. And it's certainly not going to cure drought, obviously, but it does give you a bit of a buffer in time of allowing that plant to recover from that drought stress. So think of areas in particularly rough soils where maybe it's heavy sand, or the irrigation gets shut off regularly. This might be a nice tool to buffer that period of intermediate drought. We actually had a trial done with Dr. Glenn Percival over in the UK on the effect of drought with oak trees. You'll notice that even with low rates and high rates of Cambistat, the survival rate of drought-stressed trees was much higher, 100 versus 20 in both instances to drought versus untreated. So it's a tool that you can use, leverage, and manage your trees long-term over many, many cycles of application to alleviate some of those drought conditions. And I had mentioned darker leaves because they produce more chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll or iron or manganese chlorosis can be from a variety of reasons. In some cases, it might be due to a soil deficiency of iron or manganese, but it also might be a soil compaction or a pH issue. So with Cambistat, because you have a smaller canopy with a larger root system, it's going to allow you to better utilize what nutrients are available to the plant, and you'll have more chlorophyll in the leaf tissue to begin with. So this is a trial we did with the University of Minnesota on red oak, and 3 years after the initial treatment, you can see the dramatic color change and difference in the chlorosis. So it's another tool in your toolbox to use for managing iron or manganese chlorosis. It certainly won't solve the soil compaction issue, but it can help alleviate the stress that would be seen in the plant material from that. And this is on sugar maple, done at the Morton Arboretum, and you can see the leaf tissue in the middle of the summer is much darker green. It holds up better that drought, that intermediate heat and water stress from the summer. And I mentioned iron chlorosis. Coupling it with other products such as verdure, or if you can do air spade work or adding in a soil nutrition program, it can be a nice synergist to that to make your programs much more effective. So it doesn't have to always be done on its own. And this plant, I think, is a really nice example of the urban stress of, you've got the nice turf under there. It's probably a tougher growing environment with a brand new sidewalk. and you've got iron chlorosis on top of it. Adding Cambistat with the verdure gives you a really nice green up and allows the plant to recover and put on a lot of nice growth into the canopy. And then I mentioned because you're slowing that canopy down, you develop more of the root system. So this is the fibrous root development, and that's really what we're talking about. You don't see a dramatic increase in the woody buttress root, but we do see an improvement in the fibrous roots. So those are what are going to be taking in the water and the additional nutrients. We see an increase in that over time after application. And then also the roots are able to push out further from the tree faster. So this was an interesting study from the Morton Arboretum on sugar maples that were transplanted. So the root balls were probably right about where the initial box where the root system started. And then as they grew into that soil matrix, you can see how much more root development there was with the Cambistat versus untreated. Using it in newer plantings in tough growing environments is really going to be a nice benefit for you. But then again, we've got to think about, so what are the good candidates for use of Cambistat? Think about legacy trees, trees that are large or of high value in particular in the landscape, because this is a unique service that you are going to be applying to them. And then what makes them unique? Maybe there's a particular aesthetic value to them, or a historical value, or maybe it's the one tree that they have on a property that really provides the most value to them, or is the centerpiece of their landscape. And then why are these good candidates for Cambistat? Because you want to make sure if you're investing in doing an application with Cambistat, they're also going to be doing some of those other practices such as proper pruning. Maybe if there's an insect issue, that they're doing the insect management as well. Because certainly it's not a magic bullet that's going to cure everything, but it does give you a lot of added benefit to your other programs. And when I'm looking at properties, certainly you can apply this to a whole host of plant material. I think our current application guide has almost 128 tree species. But what I'm really looking at are kind of these target plant species like oaks, maples, elms, sycamores, basswood, sweet gum, locust, zelkova, and spruce. And I mentioned spruce in particular in the upper Midwest. Cytospora canker is a big issue. We see really nice reduction in the cankering from Cytospora on spruce. So that's why I put that on there. It's not necessarily from a size maintenance aspect, it's more from a Cytospora canker management perspective. But these are kind of the tree species that I think of that are really nice targets that you see really nice growth regulation. You'll see relatively quick plant health improvement as well. And when I'm talking about size maintenance, part of what I think is important when you're talking with a homeowner or a property manager is, we're not shrinking the plant material that we already have. But it's not Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, where the tree was once 50 feet tall and now we're magically going to make it 30 feet tall. It's really about managing the future growth of the plant material. So think of trees that are in limited growing sites. Not only just the canopy size, if you have a courtyard or buildings adjacent to it, but also look at what do we have as the root zone? Do we have a limited growing space that, in 5-10 years, this tree is going to be too large for really what soil profile is available? Or maybe it's trees that need to be pruned routinely. Think about light fixtures, security cameras, windows, roofing, so on and so forth. And then if there's trees that you have to maintain a specific shape, those are a good one. Or trees that require pruning for visibility, maybe to a lake or other hardscapes or signage, for example. But it's important to set the correct expectations that you're not going to magically shrink the plant. It is a piece of nature that we're just slowing the new development of the plant. And this is a nice example of a property I think of. This is probably representative of what many of our urban tree care clients have. It's a fairly well manicured property with a wide range of materials, but really this oak makes the property. I mean, think of in the context of what would this tree or this property look like without that plant. It would drastically change the overall look, the feel, and also I think the value of this property as well. But what's important to think about is this tree really, it's kind of the maximum size that we'd ideally want it to be. We're not looking for it to double in canopy size. It's providing all the value that we want to. And also look at that root zone. That's very nice turf that's going to be competing very aggressively for nutrients. And this would be a plant that if we had to remove it, it would be a big shock to the landscape. So we're managing the long-term health of this plant and a growth regulator to slow the future canopy growth down while reallocating all of those nutrients or that energy back into the root system, into defense compounds, and so on, would really be a big added benefit. Think of, and I mentioned long-term space limitations. So this is a relatively new planting on the University of Minnesota that I thought, this is an interesting place and a good candidate for a growth regulator, that we have a hardscape with the sidewalk on both sides and a street. But there's also, if the tree, and this is I believe it's a hybrid elm, in maybe 25, 30 years, how big could it really get? Do we need it to be, encroaching on the building, and continually pruning it? So if we're managing the development of this plant over time, it can potentially have much more of a longer service life for us. But we're looking at not just the below ground, but also the canopy, looking up at what will this tree look like in 10 years, 15 years, or maybe 20 years. And then kind of the opposite end of it is for plant health improvement, kind of the front hand to the back hand, the back of the hand. I think of trees that are in potentially long-term decline. Maybe there was a construction project 10 years ago that you're starting to just kind of see that chronic stress that's occurring, or maybe it's nearing the end of its life cycle, but the homeowner really just wants to hold on to the plant as long as they possibly can. That's a good opportunity to leverage Cambistat. Or maybe if they are going to be doing construction, you can precondition the plant so it's not going to want to put on lots of canopy growth after construction. Or unfortunately, as we often come in after the construction's been done, what can we do to mitigate some of the after effects of construction? And we'll kind of get into construction here a little bit more specifically. But as I look at this property, I'm thinking about, okay, so there's a new retaining wall in there. That tree obviously was there well before the retaining wall, but what are we going to be doing to maintain this tree for the next 10 years, 20 years? We're going to have to prune it obviously for deadwood, but also how can we reduce the plant's desire to put on a lot of canopy growth to maybe compensate for root development issues or soil compaction. So we can reduce the plant's natural desire to want to put on a lot of canopy growth. And then, as I mentioned a couple times earlier, we have drought tolerance. It's with climate change and the varying changes in our weather patterns, we have periods of lots of moisture, but in a very short window. Maybe in the summers, we have periods of higher temps with no moisture. So it's kind of, how do we allow a plant that's already predisposed to a certain type of climate to tolerate that new development? So using Cambistat to mitigate some of those short-term drought stress or heat stress experiences is going to be a really powerful tool for managing the plant's long-term health. And then if we do have minor disease issues, we can suppress those, or the plant will tolerate them. Think of things like bacterial leaf scorch, cytospora canker, minor insect issues like aphids and leaf miners. It's certainly not going to obviously impact those insects or diseases directly, but it does. The plant is stronger, it's healthier, it's able to tolerate them a little better. Think of it maybe as like a minor cold versus a flu. If you're a healthier person, you're going to be able to tolerate those minor health issues much more efficiently and get back on your feet. I mentioned here, so this was a trial we installed in California. It was kind of we're looking at, sycamores are a very high value plant material in parks especially, and with although California is not in technically a drought still, trees will feel the effects of drought for much longer than 1 or 2 years. So California had about 7 years of consistent drought. So these trees are quite stressed, even though there is irrigation on the turf. It's not enough to really get down into the soil profile for the trees. And these trees have been showing some signs of drought stress with leaf scorch, some tip dieback, and we installed this trial to look at, well, what can we expect reasonably with a rate of Cambistat as an application to better tolerate those? And we installed this in August, but I'm really excited to see kind of what the results are looking like. And initially, we are seeing some color change, deeper, darker leaves in the sycamore, but also I think there might be an element of it might control a little bit of or mitigate some of the effects of sycamore and anthracnose. I do want to make the point of kind of what is a good candidate versus a not good candidate. The tree in the front foreground here is probably not a good candidate for Cambistat. I mean, the situation is ideal in that it's a limited growing space, but just that it's too far gone, it's too stressed. The potential downside is you would overregulate the plant. However, in the background, over by that pickup truck, we do have two really nice, healthy looking trees. Those would be potentially a good candidate for Cambistat. And it's really, Cambistat is not a cure-all. Like I said, it can't change, if you have heavily compacted soil after a construction issue or poor planting practices, it won't change those issues that are chronic, but it can help alleviate some of those issues that urban trees do encounter along the way. And I'd mentioned construction, and I'm going to call this out specifically. So this was a homeowner construction project, and unfortunately, this wasn't a client or anything we were doing. I just was out for a walk and I saw this, but this tree unfortunately doesn't have a really good outlook. There's no construction barriers. They have material piled up right on top of the root system. They obviously put the dumpster on top of what is part of the core root zone. It's really not a great outlook for this tree. And while outwardly it looks fairly healthy now, in probably 2 years when this is completed, you're going to start to see a lot of dieback. And unfortunately, that soil profile won't probably be corrected. Ideally, we would apply Cambistat prior to construction, but if we did do it afterwards, certainly it is a good practice. We'd want to make sure we make any rate reductions for the stress tree in any limited growing space, but we'd certainly want to recommend doing airspace work, ensuring that there's no insect issues, and we want to make sure that we're evaluating the tree prior to our application, not just willy-nilly putting it down, because if it's overstressed, we can overregulate the plant and actually cause more damage. But certainly that's what Rainbow and myself and the rest of the technical staff are here to help you do, is work through those individual situations of what should I do in this case? Is that a good candidate? What rate should I apply and how should I do that? So that's part of just kind of what we want to help you and support you in doing. And I was taking a look closer at this is another property. They were doing some road work, and they were obviously driving their small excavators over the top of this. Unfortunately, it's a beautiful American elm. It's probably about a 45-inch diameter tree. They took up the sidewalk behind it. A closer look at that sidewalk, obviously the root system was heavily damaged. This would be a good candidate for certainly some just general cultural practices in mediation, but certainly Cambistat would be a good opportunity because we don't want the plant to try to force out a lot of canopy growth to counterbalance what it's trying to recover from the root system. We would want to slow that canopy down and allow that root system to recover. So that's another usage for it. And then kind of as you're thinking about your properties and what you encounter in the landscape, look at what trees are of high value, maybe they're maximum size, or wrong tree in the wrong place, but in 10 years will be too big. So think about all those situations, and those are really ideal situations where Cambistat is an appropriate tool. So in summary here, understanding how Cambistat works will give you the ability to leverage it on the landscape to improve tree health. And there's really a wide range of opportunities where it is appropriate. So please, if you have questions or concerns, I'm here and happy to answer them. And thank you again for attending today. We're really excited about having you join us. And I apologize again for the early technical difficulties. Sometimes technology just doesn't want to work for you.
All right, thanks, Chris. So now we'll bring it to the questions part. So right now, I think in regards to growth control efficacy, we had a question about how it works for arborvitae and hawthorn hedges.
That's a great question. So with arborvitae and hawthorn, I'll start with arborvitae. You will see an improvement in the color. We actually were looking at a winter burn and winter damage trial with that as well. But what I would say, generally speaking, is that it's not going to give you dramatic growth regulation. It's going to give you minor regulation, somewhere probably around 10 to 15%, but you will see a color change. And in that, it's just the way Cambistat and paclitaxel interacts with the plant. It doesn't give you that great of a cell elongation and inhibition. Hawthorns, on the other hand, certainly would be a great candidate for it, but it's just a difference between deciduous and conifer trees.
Okay, next question is, in the past has been recommended doing a half rate dosing for Japanese maple trees. Is this the current protocol?
That would be a current protocol, and the reason for the half A rate recommendation is that Japanese maples are exceedingly sensitive to the active ingredient paclitaxel, and especially oftentimes they are quite easy to overregulate. So and oftentimes they're quite small as well, and those are two of the factors that often are what people get into trouble with. So the Japanese maple would be a definite high half A rate.
All right, next question is, sweet gum was taken off the list back in time due to distorting the leaves. Has it been put back on the list now?
Sweet gum is on the label, and it was partially in the early days. It was just too high of a rate, and sweet gum is a more sensitive species. Same thing with linden. So you want to make sure, and we have a really nice application guide that walks you through from identifying the plant material all the way through rate reductions for potentially limited growing spaces or soil compaction or general tree stress. It'll walk you through what considerations should you have and how should you get there for creating a rate.
Right, and I think this next question ties in pretty well. Let's see here. Are there any species that we should avoid due to leaf malformation?
Yes, there are a couple. In my experience, and they are not on the label, would be redbuds and dogwoods. Dogwoods and redbuds are just too sensitive that I would not recommend treating them just because the potential for overregulation is just too high.
And next question is, what is the effect on turf surrounding the base of the tree?
That's another great question. So it certainly will affect turf if it's misapplied. And how it happens most often, and what it looks like, is you'll see deeper, dark blades of grass, and it can give you kind of thin appearing turf. And in that, it's most often caused by leaching from the actual physical application. So making sure that you create a nice moat around the tree if you're doing a soil drench or a soil injection, if you're using our HTI soil injector. Ensure that you have it below or remove the landscape plastic or fabric is the big issue. And then certainly if you have a large rainstorm or something, a rain event after an application where the physical soil moves off the property, that's where we typically see it.
Okay, and then we have, what is the date of the most current rate chart?
The date of it? Sorry.
Yeah, date. That is correct.
Oh, yep. I believe the most current rate chart was updated in 2017, I believe, or 2018. And that's important. Certainly, if you're operating off of a 2002 or a 2003 rate chart, I would email us and we'll get you a new rate card because those rates have been adjusted over time to give you optimal and predictable growth regulation.
Okay, I think that was it. Maybe see if anyone else has any more questions out there. Otherwise, thank you, Chris, for presenting. And if any of you are interested in any of the other spring webinars we're hosting, just go to our website at www.treecarescience.com, and that homepage, you'll scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a spring webinar. Click on that and you'll be able to sign up for any of our upcoming ones. I believe we have a Dutch elm disease and an emerald ash borer in the hopper right now. Other than that, and we have one last question, but I think I can field that one. Do you have to do anything special to get the CEUs? Just by signing up and registering and giving us your ISA certification number, I will take that list and submit it to ISA after this. It takes about 4 to 6 weeks before you'll see those credits go up on your certification number, but no, you don't have to do anything special. We'll take care of it all on our end. So with that, I'll say thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.